But what both ethical egoism and utilitarianism have in common with one another is that they're both focusing on the consequences of one's actions, right? The outcome of one's actions, with respect to either maximizing one's own self-interest or maximizing the happiness for oneself and for others. So with Bentham's idea of the principle of utility, right, he basically thought of pleasure as being purely quantitative, right? So trying to increase pleasure in terms of quantity with respect to intensity and duration. John Stuart Mill kind of complicated that idea a little bit and made it into, right, so the foundational theory of utilitarianism is what is referred to as the greatest happiness principle. But for Mill, the greatest happiness principle is conveying that actions are right insofar as they tend to promote happiness, and actions are wrong insofar as they tend to promote the reverse of happiness or pain. And so Mill understood that, of course, some actions are going to result in pain, but it's trying to find that balance, that appropriate balance of of happiness over unhappiness, or pleasure over pain. And he recognized the fact that while he did believe that happiness was an increase in pleasure, right, or the presence of pleasure, we're not just thinking about pleasure as being purely quantitative. We're thinking about pleasure as being qualitative, right? So with the greatest happiness principle, is trying to promote the greatest amount of happiness for everyone considered, but we're not just thinking about it in terms of the self, and we're not just thinking about it in terms of the quantity of pleasure for all. We're thinking about trying to promote high quality and quantity of pleasure for all considered. So how is pleasure and pain assessed? It's really important to understand what we mean when we say pleasure and pain, because they're pretty much the foundation for what the greatest happiness principle is, right? And the greatest happiness principle is the standard of morality with utilitarianism. So we have to be very kind of specific with what we mean by happiness, meaning pleasure, right? But then we have to be specific about what we mean by pleasure. And so pleasure is something that we intrinsically valued. It's valued in itself, but we don't just exist as human beings trying to have an increase in pleasure. We're also trying to increase the quality of pleasure, right? We have different types of pleasures that we go for. And Mill categorized these as higher pleasures versus lower pleasures. So we as human beings are constantly kind of navigating between the higher pleasures of the mind and the intellect versus the lower pleasures of the body and sensations. And so we're always kind of torn between these pleasures, because the higher pleasures can be more difficult to achieve than the lower pleasures, yet the lower pleasures are not as fulfilling, right? So think back to the painting of King Sardanapalus with the Aristotle unit, and how King Sardanapalus didn't look very happy. He didn't look very satisfied, because you need something more than just achieving these bodily pleasures all the time. So what would be an example of a lower pleasure? Well, I have a photo of chocolate cake, beautiful looking chocolate cake, right? We can achieve pleasure when we taste something delicious like chocolate cake. Yet at the same time, if I just lived my life eating a bunch of chocolate cake, then I wouldn't really be healthy, right? I wouldn't be getting my nutrients. I also would need something beyond just the pleasure of eating something delicious. And we as human beings require something more. We have higher faculties. Faculties meaning abilities and capacities that we have. And we as human beings have the faculty of rationality, the faculty of the intellect, the faculty of imagination and judgment, and being able to analyze and understand things. And so therefore, we require more as human beings, right? We desire something that isn't just the pleasure of taste and eating something delicious, right? So we as human beings then are trying to think about how we can achieve more higher pleasures, even though the higher pleasures are more difficult to achieve in the long term. And sometimes we make sacrifices when it comes to, trying to achieve these higher pleasures. So for example, you are in school right now, you're trying to get a degree, and so you are sometimes trying to, maybe you're in pain right now, maybe you're not getting enough sleep, right? You're stressed out. And so that's an example of how sometimes you have to make some sacrifices in the short term in order to achieve more long-term pleasure. So more is required for us than what's required for animals, even though we face a more difficult path in trying to achieve these higher pleasures. So what are some other examples of higher pleasures that we're trying to achieve as human beings? The pleasures of reading a wonderful novel, the pleasure of morality. So we feel good when we volunteer, we feel good when we do the right thing, the pleasure of love and friendship, right? So even though these pleasures are more difficult to achieve, right, we do live our lives trying to seek these pleasures, right, even though we are motivated by trying to achieve the lower pleasures as well. So what happens then, since we're always trying to navigate between trying to achieve these higher pleasures versus these lower pleasures? Well, we as human beings are familiar with both, right? We live our lives, we're just familiar with both. So we end up trying to kind of combine these pleasures, but at the same time, we are desiring these higher pleasures more because we know that they're more valuable, right? They are more fulfilling than the lower pleasures. Now, many of us have felt depressed or sad or not content with our lives, right? We're trying to achieve these higher pleasures, but we are disappointed, or maybe there's a lot of obstacles, right? Because these higher pleasures are more difficult to achieve, so there's going to be more in the way sometimes. Yet, many of us still aren't willing to throw away our higher capacities, our higher faculties, just to be happier, right? Just to be more content. Why is that, right? Why do we work so hard to achieve these higher pleasures, even though it would be a lot easier to just live for these lower pleasures? Well, we as human beings all share a sense of dignity, right? A sense of dignity. Think back to Kant with respect to how we should be treated with autonomy and respect, and we are rational beings, right? These are things we value. We value being able to be rational. We value our independence and freedom. And that goes into our sense of pride, our sense of dignity. And so things that tend to contrast or contradict the sense of dignity are not desirable for us as human beings, right? We don't want to be oppressed. We don't want to be marginalized. We don't want to be demeaned by other people, right? Because they all violate our sense of dignity that is so important to us as human beings. So this is why we work so hard to achieve these higher pleasures, because we all have this sense of dignity. Now, I'm sure there are situations where you might be sad, or you might think, you know what, I wish I was a child again, or I wish I was a dog, where I could just be so excited putting my head out of a car window, right? And why am I so dissatisfied as a human being? Now, Mill understands that tension we experience, but he said that even though we experience unhappiness and dissatisfaction, right, it's still better to be Socrates than a fool, right? So he says, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied, right? So we still desire these intellectual capacities more than the satisfaction we have if we were a fool or if we were children, right? Think back to how easy it was to be happy when you were a child. You were so happy with eating a cookie or going outside and riding your bike or watching a Disney film, right? And that changes as you become older and you have more responsibilities and you know more about the world, right? So it might be more difficult to watch a Disney film now. Or maybe when you eat a cookie, you're realizing, oh no, this is unhealthy, whereas when you were a kid, you never thought about that. So it is a lot easier when you have lower developed faculties to be happy, yet it's still more valuable to be someone with these higher faculties and dissatisfied sometimes, right? It's just an inevitable aspect of the human condition. So you might be thinking, well, I know a bunch of people who aren't really trying to achieve these higher pleasures, right? They're not really focused on long-term life goals. They're not trying to achieve anything with their career or education. Maybe they're just like hanging out at home all day, playing video games or watching Netflix or smoking pot all day or whatever it is that people do, right? So you might be thinking, well, Mill doesn't really seem to get how people actually exist. He did understand that because he did recognize that it is really difficult to achieve these higher pleasures, right? The capacity for them, our ability to achieve them, is as delicate and sensitive as a plant, right? Plants need a certain amount of sunlight and water. And when they aren't getting that, they die. So it's also like learning a new language. If you stop learning that language, if you stop speaking in that language, or if you stop writing in that language, you kind of forget how to use it. And so that's how these higher pleasures are, right? If we don't really fulfill them, if we don't nourish them, we will lose them. And it's a gradual process that can happen over time. Now, it's not, a situation where someone intentionally says, you know what, I'm going to just start living for my lower pleasures, forget these higher pleasures. It's something that happens kind of over time, given our context, given the different influences we have in life. So sometimes people do engage in sensual indulgences at the expense of their health, right? We eat things that we know aren't healthy. We drink things that we know aren't healthy. We engage in behaviors that aren't healthy for us or for other people, yet we still do it, right? So what's happening here? Why is there this disconnect between the ideal versus what we actually do? Well, we are influenced by one another, right? We can be influenced by one another. We live amongst one another in a society. So we can be influenced by the culture we live in. If we live in a very materialistic culture and we just see people who have, cars and expensive things and a bunch of money be celebrated and worshiped, then we might think, oh, well, I guess it doesn't matter, right, if you're achieving these higher pleasures. We also can stifle these higher pleasures because we're so concerned with trying to achieve these bare necessities, right? We need to be able to make enough money so we can eat and pay for rent or shelter or clothing and feel safe and comfortable. And many people don't have that fulfilled. So if you don't have those basic needs fulfilled, then how are you ever going to be able to achieve these higher pleasures, right? So what ends up happening is that, unfortunately, in this very telling quote here from Mill, he says, "Men lose their high aspirations as they lose their intellectual tastes, because they have not time or opportunity for indulging them, and they addict themselves to inferior pleasures, not because they deliberately prefer them, but because they are either the only ones to which they have access or the only ones which they are any longer capable of enjoying." So he does convey, he recognizes that it is really difficult to achieve these higher pleasures, to be in a supportive environment where you can, to have the abilities where you can even think about these things, right? If you're working constantly, let's say you're working at McDonald's and you're working these super long shifts, what do you feel like doing when you get home? Do you feel like reading philosophy? No, you probably don't, right? You just want to relax and watch some silly TV show or something, or go to sleep, right? So it's easy to get in this cycle where you work, you come home, you're exhausted, you wake up the next day, you work, you come home, you're exhausted. So it's really difficult to get out of that cycle and nourish those higher pleasures. So Aristotle says that our youthful enthusiasm collapses into sensual indulgences, right? Our youthful enthusiasm collapses into selfishness and indolence and laziness, where we're kind of just stagnating, we're not really growing, we're not really flourishing as human beings. So given what we know about the tension that we as human beings are constantly kind of embodying between these higher pleasures and these lower pleasures, and the end of our moral action is to promote these higher pleasures, not just for ourselves, but for the rest of humanity, right? How do we act? What is the guide for our actions? Well, Mill basically says that human beings have assessed both types of pleasures, right? And so he's assessing, or he's creating his moral theory based off of the feelings and the judgments of human beings, right? Based off of how we have tried to combine these different types of pleasures and how we have had some sort of universal agreement on what's pleasurable and what's painful, right? So he's just going based off of the general feeling of those who are familiar with both types of pleasures, right? What we feel, how we judge these pleasures. So when we think about the end or the goal of our actions, it's trying to achieve a high quality and quantity of pleasure and to decrease pain and to avoid pain. So what is a standard of morality, right? How are we assessing actions? Well, it's through the greatest happiness principle, which we talked about, right? Promoting the right amount of happiness over unhappiness, or the right amount of pain, or sorry, the right amount of pleasure over pain. And so he says The greatest happiness principle, right, is reflective of the ultimate end with reference to and for the sake of which all other things are desirable. So we intrinsically desire happiness, therefore we should live our lives in ways that promote our happiness and other people's happiness, right? We're abstaining from pain, we should abstain from pain and not contribute to other people's pain. And we're trying to live our lives that is rich in enjoyments of quality and quantity together. So the end of human action, the consequences of our actions become the standard of morality for utilitarianism, right? We are trying to figure out what is right or wrong based off of the outcome and the consequence of our actions. So think about how utilitarianism could be used to understand political conflicts. Think about how it can be used to understand political violence, such as war and terrorism and torture and revolution, because these are conflicts that happen on a macro or a larger scale. So we're really thinking about the greatest happiness of all considered. And who are we considering, right? Are we considering just this one country? Are we considering the entire world, right? So utilitarianism has been such an influential theory when we think about political violence, right? It's influenced just war theory and many other kind of political theories that try to understand the morality or lack thereof of political violence like war and terrorism. All right, so that is all I have for today. Thank you so much.